Hello, everyone, and welcome to session 10 of the University of Nicosia's MOOC on digital currency. I'll be covering for Antonis Polemitis for the next few minutes until he reaches us and carries on with the session on regulation. So the topic today is everything that has to do with the interface of the conventional regulatory environment and how digital currency fits within what exists and how it might fit with what new regulation will be structured to address specifically the nature of digital currency in the future. So I'll start off with one of the more technical questions that have to do with a posting from MIT, which happened the last couple of days, and a Bitcoin core developer, Peter Todd, addressed it as a red flag that the world of Bitcoin should be careful of, because a few researchers from MIT posted a method through which it would structure groups that would audit and perform KYC and AML in blockchain-based networks, whether open, private, or even insinuating it could be used in Bitcoin itself. So I'd like to address this for a second, as it falls a bit more towards the technical perspective of what's possible and what we could be seeing. So first of all, this is just a suggestion. And the fact that a couple of researchers did the suggestion does not mean that the whole of MIT is behind it, or that MIT is an evil organization, and things like this, which I've seen on the internet over the last day. So it's just a suggestion, and it's like everything else in Bitcoin, it can be adopted or ignored. The way the incentive structures work in Bitcoin allow the market and the users and the miners to vote with their feet or with their hash rate, according to what each has, towards what they want to see in the network. If there's a change that drives the whole network and usage towards some certain vulnerability, it will not be adopted. So there's a lot of flexibility in how Bitcoin works, and we'll have to see every proposal for its face value and what it can contribute to the network before everyone decides what is going to happen with it. So I wouldn't take it, I would take all these suggestions with a grain of salt, because they're very recent, and I don't expect anything to come out of them for the next few months, at least, until we see a more solid proposal on what could happen. So moving on to the question done by Roland Creve regarding confidentiality in transactions, the fungibility of Bitcoin, and whether that could be used as an extension of Chain Anchor, which was this research proposal by MIT, to change or make Bitcoin even less fungible. So confidential transactions will and are proposed as an implicit increase in fungibility, as it will make the outputs of a transaction less obvious and less trackable to anyone watching the blockchain. And practically the same is done by CoinJoin. It's a technique for mixing transactions, and especially UTXOs, which was proposed by Greg Maxwell, I think, back in 2013. What other currencies are using, especially like Monero, the ring signatures, and structured under the whole CryptoNote convention that they're working on, is a far more fungible solution as it exists right now. And as it is, it probably cannot be implemented directly on Bitcoin the way it is right now. So this would mean that we would need a very altering hard fork to be able to do something like this, or we'd the most ideal scenario, based from suggestions from core developers so far, is to apply these more fungible methods on side chains, especially. So there was several proposals about how to draft so-called Borromean ring signatures, which was done by Greg Maxwell, again, sometime in about a year ago, on how it could be applied to a sidechain so that it can increase fungibility. Since any transaction that would go into a sidechain that cannot be monitored and goes back into the main chain of Bitcoin would break the so-called trail of compromised fungibility, which would mean that most efforts of blacklisting would find gaps, which in most cases you wouldn't be able to track back to the original beginnings. So I hope this covers it for now, and I'm really curious where Antonis is right now. Let's see. Yes, his computer is updating, and he should be with us in a few minutes. At the same time, if you have any questions, feel free to post them on your questions tab on the Google Plus event. So we'll cover it. He's definitely a far bigger expert on regulation than me, so I wouldn't want to venture too much into his territory. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Antonis has fallen victim to Windows 10, which has happened to a lot of us. I assume it updates whenever it wants. It doesn't ask us whether we like it or not. So yes, it might mean we might have to take a bit longer. So okay, I'm going to try to talk a bit more generally about what we saw in session 10 and how I expect that to play out in the future. So we saw that even though digital currency per se is not something which you can apply direct regulation to, since it's peer-to-peer and it's harder to pinpoint single points of failure that you can malleate, let's say, in order to make them do your bidding, like is the case for Ripple, where it was far easier to find Ripple Labs, and the SEC told them that, look, you have to change these things so that you can continue working. But the interface with the conventional systems, conventional regulation, whether that's commodities, whether that's securities law, okay, we have Antonis, is another thing altogether. And the approach that we've seen so far is the typical approach where you have four blind people grabbing different parts of the elephant and trying to describe what each individual part is without actually being able to see the whole elephant for what it is and be able to describe it in that way. So Antonis, welcome. Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Wonderful.
I'm very sorry. Whoa, why do I have this echo? I want to apologize for my delay because I was a couple minutes late to begin with, and then Windows decided to reboot my updates overnight.
Now the whole...
And for some reason, my computer is now in Danish, and it has busted all my two-factor authentications. And so I'm quite confused, actually. So I'm very sorry, everyone, for my delay. Hopefully, you guys have been having a good discussion in the interim.
Okay, do we have access to the questions? Do you want me to paste them somewhere for you?
I do have access to the questions.
Nice.
Have you guys covered any of them so far? Have you been talking about other topics?
I feel like I've covered the more technical question about this recent event with Chain Anchor out of MIT.
Yep.
And what this could mean about mixing coins, the whole fungibility discussion, how ring signatures could be implemented on top of Bitcoin or side chains.
Yep.
Unless we have follow-up questions on these, I think we can move on.
All right. So should we do the question about Thailand then?
Yeah, sure.
So let me read it to everyone. We'll start with there. The question is, I live in Thailand, and to keep it brief, the largest exchange, bx.in.th, only allows for locally produced Bitcoins to be traded, and any Bitcoins from the exchange cannot be sold overseas, something that cannot be enforced and is ignored by everyone. An excerpt from the terms and conditions is at the end of this message, and let's read the excerpt. The excerpt says, no foreign currency exchange. The customer must agree never to exchange currencies purchased from the website for any foreign currency other than the Thai baht. The customer must also guarantee that any cryptocurrency the customer sells at the website has never been involved in exchange with any foreign currency other than the Thai baht. Thailand is a currency that has strict capital controls, as this is to be expected. In my opinion, such regulation and controls has damaged the financial industry's ability to innovate and leaves everyone dealing and using Bitcoin in a gray area that can be arrested or leaned upon by politicians and corrupt civil servants if they become too prominent. Bitcoin was once the savior to the unbanked world, but it would seem that only the developed world and more enlightened jurisdictions can take advantage of it. How do you see the situation going forward? How would we get the dictators and leaders of the developing world to embrace the benefits of Bitcoin? Or would it simply flourish underground because it cannot be stopped? Well, hey, that's very interesting. I have never seen terms and conditions like that before, and they are amusing to say the least. Only buying Bitcoins that have only interacted with Thai baht is the most particularly amusing part of that. I guess that does mean they would have to be locavore, locally grown Bitcoins that came right to the exchange. And then once you have them, not using them for anything other than Thai baht is another interesting topic. So obviously, the part of once you take your Bitcoins to the exchange, from the exchange, don't use them for anything else, is theoretically unenforceable in practice, right? Now, it kind of depends, because you can de-anonymize if you're very technically proficient. So you are probably taking some risk if the Thai government was super proficient at going after a hardcore de-anonymization. But in practice, it's probably unenforceable today. But I think you're right about the implications. It puts everyone in a gray zone, and it allows people to then put leverage on you, and particularly when you're talking about a centralized exchange, right? Like, the reality is, let's think about how that would work. If the exchange requires KYC, right, and you bought Bitcoins, and then you told it which Bitcoin wallet to send it to, the Thai government would know who bought those Bitcoins. And if those Bitcoins then ended up at a known address known to be outside of Thailand, if they ended up at Coinbase, and technically that's a violation of these terms of service and possibly the Thai law and possibly traceable to you. Now, it's tricky because what is a government that has currency controls gonna say, accept this, right? Because from the time they have currency controls, it's pretty hard for them to say, we have currency controls, except in this one case, which is if you buy Bitcoin, you can go right around our currency controls and it's no problem, right? So it's problematic. Bitcoin is deeply problematic for a government that has currency controls, and centralized exchanges in Bitcoin are probably going to have issues. So either they'll have terms of service like this, or in practice, my guess is, since chasing people around is going to be tedious, if it ever got big, they might get shut down, to be honest. That's what I would actually expect in a currency-controlled country. And so then the question is, well, does that mean it's all over? There's no Bitcoin. It's not going to apply to the developing world. I think it's a matter of timing. Certainly, regulation can help or hinder adoption. So if you have a clear framework, if you're told that you can operate legally, if businesses can be built legally, so executives aren't worried that they themselves are going to get in trouble, those countries will take the lead on cryptocurrency. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It is absolutely the case that a favorable regulatory framework will lead to further development versus a less favorable one. In the longer run, there's going to be leakage, though, even to countries that aren't interested in it. And the simplest way around these centralized places where you can, in fact, block people is for people to just accept Bitcoin. Like, it's not even doing a decentralized exchange, right? It's not localbitcoins.com. If you had a critical mass of people accepting Bitcoin for payment, you'd have a critical mass of people accepting Bitcoin for payment. And then so someone could say, oh, sure, let's say if I was Thai and I was willing to like skirt around the law a little bit, and I was a merchant, now I probably can't put this front and center in my store, right? But you'd say, yeah, I'd give you a 5% discount for Bitcoins, right? That at a decentralized level, at a person-to-person level, is much harder to block. It's what you see in currency-controlled countries where there's effectively a black market for hard currency, right? So that's the analogy. Like in Argentina, nobody trades at the official rate, right? There's a black market for US dollars. That's at a very different rate, same as Venezuela. And people will want to get their hands on that internationally valid currency that is the US dollar and are willing to pay up relative to the official exchange rates and currency controls. And so if you simply just started accepting Bitcoin, now again, it's early, right? Because if you're a merchant, you said, oh, I'll give you a discount for Bitcoin, you probably still wouldn't pick up too many Bitcoins in 2016. But it probably changes over time. Depends how aggressive the government is. Like, are they going to try and put you in jail if you do that? Can you advertise it openly? Can you not? But in time, there's leakage. In time, markets find a way. I mean, there was an epic series in the Wall Street Journal last year about all the different ways capital escapes China, which is also currency controlled. And people talk about Bitcoin as a mechanism, but it's the tip of the iceberg. Chinese companies go buy foreign companies. Chinese people set up companies maybe in their relatives' hands outside of China and over-invoice the Chinese companies. Chinese people take the amount of hard currency that can be moved out of the country and spread it over hundreds of people and move it out a small amount at a time. Now, none of these are technically legal, but billions of dollars of capital does escape China every year through these mechanisms that are not the formal exchange control mechanisms. So it never goes to zero, it's never as easy as in a country that that has open currency controls, right? It's a lot easier to move dollars in and out of the United States than it is to move yuan in and out of China. But you never get 100% compliance either. You see the same thing in information technology. China has a firewall, right? So they block certain websites. Then people use VPNs and they get around it. Now, fewer people get around it than if they didn't have a firewall. And then they block VPNs. So then people use other VPNs. And so there's always going to be, these walls will always be leaky. How leaky they are honestly depends on how aggressive your government's going to be totally honest, I think. Because governments can scare people. If I was running a country and I didn't have any moral constraints and I wanted to keep Bitcoin from developing, execute 5 Bitcoin users. That'll have a salutary effect on the next of them, right? There's a lot of people who would do something that says, oh, well, there's no chance in practice I'll get caught, or that's one level, right? Or, oh, well, maybe I'll have a fine. Oh, maybe I'll go in jail. Oh, it's North Korea. I'm going to be executed, right? North Korea has been able to repress all types of information technology development by that method. Right? No one is going to take that, or very few people are going to take that gamble. So it's hard to say. As no different than the internet. I'm old enough to remember this. When cyberspace, not the internet, cyberspace was going to be a land beyond regulations. Did not turn out that way. Because so long as we have physical presence in a country, and that country has policemen and jails and judges, you can put pressure on the individual people involved. And if you can put pressure on the individual people involved, you can create outcomes that you want. And then it's all a spectrum. You can never get rid of all of it, right? Someone's going to take, the more aggressive you are, the more you can get rid of. The less ethical you are, the more you can get rid of. But it never all goes away. And so I would look at my analogies for thinking about this question would be black market currency smuggling in traditional currencies. So happens almost inevitably when you have capital controls and a fixed exchange rate, right? And those things go together often. That eventually a black market rate emerges, because usually people are trying to maintain that rate. And the reality is that a decent amount of money ends up trading at the black market rate. And then the other analogy is regimes that try and contain information flows on the internet. And it's not just China, right? Turkey has knocked Twitter offline several times. And you say, well, what does that even mean? Well, what it means is a judge in Turkey sends an order to the telecoms to block Twitter across all of Turkey. And since most people, if you have a mobile connection, it's still going through a centralized chokehold at the telecom. If you have a fixed land connection, it's still going through a centralized operations center at the telecom. It can be blocked. That only goes away on the information side when you really have mesh peer-to-peer phones, right? Where my phone is communicating with the guy next to me, who's communicating with the guy next to me, and it's not going through a central area that can be blocked. And that's when you'll have real actual information flow. And so I use that analogy to think about Bitcoin too. Well, Bitcoin can go peer-to-peer, right? It is peer-to-peer. But then you need a critical mass of people using it for it to be valuable peer-to-peer. It does have that issue. So if I wanted to say, hey, I'm going to give you a Bitcoin in Thailand, and you can't change it to bot at an exchange, you have to be pretty confident you can use it for something valuable for yourself, right? And if you can't, it will trade at a big discount. On the other hand, if you're trying to get it out of the country and people think there's a good mechanism to get it out of the country, it'll trade at a premium. So it's an interesting way. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, George, don't the Chinese exchanges always trade at a slight premium to the rest of the world?
No, I'm not 100% sure that's always valid, but sometimes we see premiums depending on the exchange. They don't even have the same price, so there's always that.
Okay, interesting. Another question is asking me if I'm concerned about the clause of Windows 10 end user license where Microsoft can access your files with a good faith reason to do so. Well, I'll be honest, I have not read the end user's license of Windows 10, even though that's exactly what I'm running right now. Can we look at the actual clause? Can someone paste it in there? I mean, I guess it's while we pull that up, I mean, I guess it's theoretically possible, but
so
it seems slightly implausible, to be totally honest.
You want me to read the exact text?
Yeah, that'd be great.
We will access, disclose, and preserve personal data, including your content, as the content of your emails, other private communications, or files in private folders, when we have a good faith that doing so is necessary to protect our customers or enforce the terms governing the use of the services.
Well, that's fairly broad. Wow. That's really something. I was expecting that to end with when we have a valid court order.
No, the only thing that they say in the privacy statement is, however, we do not use what you say in email, chat, video calls, or voicemail, or your documents, photos, or other personal files to target ads to you. That's the only point they stop at.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because they would say that clause is there for be able to get against hackers, spammers, blah, 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 blah. That's what they would say, but it's very broad. It doesn't say that exactly. What is the reasons they said to protect the user experience, to protect the service? What is the exact language?
To protect their customers or enforce the terms governing the use of the services.
That's very broad.
It's as vague as it gets. Come on.
It's very broad. Including your communication, right? Is that what they said?
Yes, private communications or files in private folders.
Well, I learned something today.
What constitutes good faith, right? That's the question.
And I'm sure it's good faith in their own discretion. Well, I think I learned something useful today. Thank you for posting the question. I suspect in practice, stealing your Bitcoin wallet is probably pretty low on Microsoft's list of priorities. I would be more concerned about the private communication and private files aspect of that. That, you know, this would be more alarming to me, not because, hey, Microsoft is going to think I need to grab $500 from this guy or $5,000 to this guy because I'm going to do a civil forfeiture of his money. It's probably more likely to be used against you if you're, I don't know, a dissident somewhere, right? governments tend to care about these things much more than monetary issues, to be totally honest. Like, you don't usually get these big violations of privacy and constitutional rights and what have you on average just to steal a little bit of money. It's not big, it's not important enough to them. Governments tend to have lots of ways to access money, including just taxing you. All right. So where they tend to put pressure is for politically unpopular speech, positions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's very interesting. I wonder if that's enforceable. That's because, these types of shrink-wrapped agreements, you can take them to a judge and say, like, this is unconscionable. No one would actually agree to this, because the courts do recognize that nobody ever reads them. And so that is broader than I would have expected. What do you think, George? What's your feeling on that? Is that broader than what you would have expected?
Yes, it's far broader than I expected. And what I'm actually looking at is whether some of these are opt-in or whether they're there by default. I think those are the default settings, but some of those issues you can opt out of. And that's what I'm not 100% sure, because when I installed Windows 10, I tried removing all these privacy sensitive prompts whenever I was asked. But I haven't taken even more steps to privatize my information towards Microsoft. So I'm really looking into how much data does Microsoft actually have on me, which is very interesting.
Do you guys now know who? Hold on, let me get you the link. You know who Richard Stallman is?
Yeah, we had him here last week.
Oh, we did?
Yeah.
Where do we have him?
Not here in Athens, I mean. He was speaking at a conference. So I asked him a lot of questions about Bitcoin. I'm waiting for the replies yet.
So he is probably the truest practitioner, at least publicly known, of using computing in a completely theoretically correct, privacy protective, open source manner. And so then if you read how he uses a computer, it's pretty tough stuff. Like, for example, I am careful in how I use the internet. I generally do not connect to websites from my own machine, aside from a few sites I have a special relationship with. I usually fetch web pages from other sites by sending mail to a program that fetches them, much like wget, and then mails them back to me. Then I look at them using a web browser, unless it's easy to see the text in the HTML page directly. I usually try links first, then a graphical browser if the page needs it, using Conqueror, which won't fetch from other sites in such a situation. I occasionally browse unrelated sites using IceCat via Tor. Except for rare cases, I do not identify myself to them. I think that's enough to prevent my browsing from being connected to me. I never pay for anything on the web. Anything on the net that requires payment, I don't do. Blah, 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 blah. So it goes pretty deep if you actually start thinking about how you could implement privacy on your computer on the internet.
So Don applauds you for being a fan of RMS, as he's generally known, and he says his faith in humanity is restored. So
there's another one that says, how to prevent being hacked. Don't own a computer. If you own one, throw it away. Whereas, don't own a computer, don't turn on a computer, throw away a computer if you have one. It's something like that. Look, everything in computing, as in life itself, is a risk reward trade-off, right? And your mileage will vary based on what the specifics of your circumstances are. If I am a fairly normal, not hugely politically active person in a relatively open country like the United States, am I hugely worried? Do I have like a conceptual worry? Yeah, but am I hugely worried? Not really, to be honest, because most of the reasons they want personal information for you on the internet is to better target ads at you. I mean, that's most of it. It's where the real big scalable money is. If I was a dissident in, pick whatever you consider a repressive regime, so we don't make any political statements here, well, then I'd be vastly, hugely more careful. Your risk profile is very, very different. And I think this applies to everything in life. Do I feel comfortable walking around at 3 in the morning in Nicosia? Yeah. Can't say it's 100% safe, but it's pretty darn close to it. Would I feel comfortable walking around at 3 in the morning in, pick whatever your image is, of a very unsafe place? No. Right? And so these things are always a spectrum. Unless you're extraordinarily motivated like Richard is, you're always going to be somewhere on the spectrum. You're never going to have a completely clean computing experience, right? And if you want to take advantage of the fairly substantial productivity benefits of modern computing and modern internet, you're giving up quite a bit on privacy in practice. And so in that context, and sorry, there's a roundabout way to answer the question, am I particularly worried that Microsoft would try and steal my Bitcoin wallet? No, not really. I find it hard to find a plausible reason Microsoft would be that particularly involved in that. But if I was, and if I had a lot of money in my Bitcoin wallet and I thought this might be an issue, well, great. Get a computer, put a clean version of Linux on it, and anyway, take it off the internet. Right? Like back it up to a paper wallet, blah, 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 blah. Right? Like that's Bitcoin, and Bitcoin security, as you guys saw earlier in the course, is a whole one of these projects of its own. Right? And if you want, I like to think to myself that there's many Bitcoins, not that there's many individual Bitcoins, but there's many Bitcoins is many things to many different people. Okay. If Bitcoin is political money that you don't want tied to the existing financial system, and that's important to you, it can be that, but it's pretty esoteric to do that. Right? Like the number of people, regular area dad, who's going to go through all the steps to have a completely secure individual wallet, not going to be many people that will do that. Most people, when given the choice, will opt for convenience. I think that's what happens in practice. And you see that all day long with every decision you make. Like you go to any web page, on average, unless you're taking proactive measures, you have 30, 40, 50 companies tracking every single thing you do. Sending back data about your browsing to huge databases. There is I'm sure, a fairly complete profile of my life in multiple data brokers in the United States. And I'm sophisticated. I know how to run the software to even tell me who's looking at me. Right? And on the whole, do I do that much about it? Not really. Right? And so will Bitcoin scale to billions of regular consumers in the process that it is now for running a completely secure Bitcoin wallet where it starts with, get a fresh install of X and don't connect it to the internet? No. Right? The average person hasn't managed to keep their antivirus updated. Right? Like, and not to pick on anyone in particular, but I get various calls from various family members all times like, hey, my computer's doing this, and it's something, fairly basically obvious, and they still don't really know how to handle it. So I don't see, but the nice thing is the possibility is there. And this is the same thing as the web, right? It might be the case that we spend most of our time not on the open web. We spend it on Facebook and on Twitter. But the fact that the open web exists is very, very important. And I think Bitcoin's going to be like that. It might be that most people end up transacting with Bitcoin through some type of semi-centralized service. But the fact that the open version exists is important to keep the whole system honest, let's say. And it is a much different world to say you have the open web, of which Facebook captures a whole bunch of attention in that web, and before that it was MySpace, and before that it was someone else, right? Than to say you have Minitel, that's a completely closed system. And you could be definitively thrown off Minitel, whereas you can't be definitively thrown off the web. You can't be, from the time that Bitcoin exists, you can't really, short of being physically detained, be cut out completely of the financial system, which is not the case with the electronic financial system today. You'd have to operate in cash. Right? So I think that is very interesting catch, by the way. Very interesting. Like I said, I learned something today. But in practice, I doubt, of all the risks to my Bitcoin wallet, is I'd be much more worried about malware than Microsoft taking it. Right? There's a much bigger prize. There's a much bigger prize, and I can think of what the incentive pathway is for someone to get a keylogger on my computer, and they don't need to take the file, right? They can just walk away with the Bitcoins all by themselves. And that's a very interesting prize. That there's all types of plausible pathways by how someone will do that. And it's happened, and it's going to continue to happen. And if Bitcoin ever became really big, it would happen all the time. So those are still probably the bigger risks. Does that make sense?
Yep.
All right. A plethora of uses of cryptocurrency is based on services that the blockchain could bring beyond currency. A lot of these rely on minimal exchanges of cryptocurrencies that would have zero impact on issues such as money laundering, terrorism activity funding, money transmission, tax evasion. Do you think these services could potentially have a delayed development due to authorities not deciding on cryptocurrencies regulation as part of the financial system? An extreme example is that this is already happening in countries like Russia or Bolivia, where activities involving cryptocurrencies are straightforward banned. Yes. The question is a good question, and the question was answered in itself, and I agree with it. If you're a country that takes a very aggressive view on Bitcoin regulation, you will deter development of Bitcoin services, and you will deter development of Bitcoin services not just for the things that you're worried about, funding terrorists or what have you, protecting the children or what have you, but all the hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of services that are going to be built, that are going to be able to be built now that we have a decentralized store of value, that we have a decentralized ledger, that we have a decentralized store of trust. That's the reality. And that's the answer to governments, by the way, that want to ban it. It's easy to see the benefits you think you're getting from banning it. It's harder to see the costs that you're incurring by banning it, because that's all in missed potential. And the best way to argue it is by analogy. I remember when the internet first started getting consumer appeal, you'd hear things like, well, wait, just anyone can write anything on the internet? Like, who's going to edit it? Who's going to, like, anyone can just say anything? Sounds scary. I mean, like, for years that was an issue. Because up until the internet, for something to get in writing was a big project. It cost money, and there was a gatekeeper. It's a newspaper, it's a magazine, it's a book. There was quite literally an editor. There was a gatekeeper. I could theoretically print up my own posters at Kinko's and start posting around the neighborhood, but like, you don't get any reach that way. So any written communication that had reach before the internet had to go through a gatekeeper. It's very hard for anyone from this generation to think about that. And so the written word had this level of authority and credibility for it. It's in writing. Well, why? Because it's in writing, costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of money. You can't let everyone write. So then you have to pick who you're going to spend the money on and who's going to pick a qualified expert, an editor. So if you're coming from that world, it's actually a sensible, in quotes, concern. Oh, well, now everyone's going to write everything without an editor? How will I know which things in writing to believe? How will I know which ones are credible? Maybe there should be some type of blogging license. Maybe there should be like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe someone should check things before they're written. I don't know. Stuff like that. You'd actually like hear proposals that now 20 years later sound completely and totally absurd. And let's say someone had succeeded in implementing those things. Think how much utility would have been lost to the world if people couldn't just write things on the internet. And my guess is part of the reason they did not succeed in blocking these things is because the internet developed in the United States. And the United States, at least of any major country, maybe other countries, maybe the best in the world, but certainly of the major countries, has the strongest protection of speech in the world. It is one of the most amazing things about the American Constitution is the First Amendment. Because you can get up and say close to anything, including things that can be very annoying to very powerful people, and you can't get in trouble for that. That's not true in a lot of places, right? Like, look what's happening now in Germany, where they're going to possibly prosecute this poet for writing an insulting poem about Erdogan because there's some law that says you can't insult foreign leaders in Germany. And it's some like 19th century law. Well, in an American perspective, that's totally absurd, right? I mean, it seems silly from any perspective, but where you have the First Amendment, that law is de facto unconstitutional. And so the First Amendment made it very difficult for someone to come and say, well, we got to regulate what people say over the internet. All right. To the degree Bitcoin's money gets trickier because there's a lot more regulation on money items. Some people try and make the aggressive argument that Bitcoin's just a form of speech, right? They try and cover it under the First Amendment. Interesting. I don't know. It's interesting. It's a very complicated legal question. Campaign contributions ended up getting First Amendment protection in the United States as it was a form of speech. Right? So that was indirectly money picking up First Amendment protection. So that's the case that I'd make to my local government. If you just focused on all the scary things that were going to happen on the internet, pornography, criminals, people saying anything, people learning how to make bombs, all this type of stuff, right? You could have said that the internet would have been a bad thing and we better keep a tight handle on it. And then you would have lost out on the greatest wealth generator to society the last 20 years. And not just in quantifiable things like, oh, Google's very valuable, but in things that aren't quantifiable. I remember when I was a kid, my parents saved up and bought me an Encyclopedia Britannica. It was a very fancy, like, thing that like middle class families did because they wanted their kids to do well in school, and like it was a big thing. There was like a whole bookshelf in my bedroom that was just the Encyclopedia Britannica, so I could use it for book reports and use it like probably an upper middle class thing. It was $1,500 in the 80s, right? It's a lot of money. And now that same thing, except much, much better, much, much broader, is available to everyone on the planet for free in Wikipedia. Doesn't even appear in GDP statistics anywhere, by the way. Right? Like, we are just literally, as a society, richer because that exists. And nobody in 1993 said, oh, we're going to have free open source encyclopedias. Because I remember even when Wikipedia was first launching, everyone said, well, this will never work. You're going to have an encyclopedia where anyone can write in it? If newspaper articles and magazine articles were something that you needed an authority figure to edit it, encyclopedias were like the epitome of that. Encyclopedia Britannica was like the epitome of the world's expert on the French Revolution is going to make sure that what we write about the French Revolution is correct. And now you're going to let random Joe on the internet like write about the French Revolution? What if he put something wrong? There's no way this is going to be accurate. And then a few years in, they did tests, and it was just as accurate as Encyclopedia Britannica. And today it's probably more accurate. Encyclopedia Britannica has basically stopped existing. And so this is what governments miss. It's easy to see the costs, but everything has a cost, right? Cash has a cost. Money has a cost. Driving a car has a cost. The most insane thing you will do every day is get in a car. And we normalize it because the benefits exceed the costs. But it's nuts if you think about it. Yep, I see it. 1 million people a year die in car accidents. There's nothing on the internet, on terrorism, on money laundering, on trafficking, on whatever, that causes 1 million deaths a year. Nothing even causes a fraction of that. And yet nobody thinks, oh, wow, God, I'm doing something really nuts today. I'm going to drive to work. Everyone drives to work all the time. And so these are where one would hope governments will take an enlightened view. I think in practice, some will, some won't. And then you hope the ones that don't eventually see that the ones that have are generating wealth and productivity and new innovation and new services for their citizens, and then they'll come along. And so that's usually how it plays out, right? Like, eventually it becomes inconceivable to not have the internet, right? You have to be North Korea to not have the internet. Eventually it will be inconceivable not to have digital currencies of some type. And at some point, all these laws will get reversed at some point, I suspect. To the last question, and because I have to pop to another call, maybe governments could avoid all regulations for millibits using. It's tricky. The question is, where do you get the bitcoins in the first place, right? I think the U.S. approach is reasonable enough. They KYC you. If you're going to have a regulatory approach, they KYC you where it interacts with U.S. dollars, and then that's that. Then once you have your bitcoins, you do whatever you want with them, right? If you're going to have a regulatory approach, that's because, you say, oh, I'll just use millibits. Well, where do I get the millibits from? Right? Like and this, by the way, we'll close with this, This is 21 & Co.'s approach. They're down at the very, very, very microservices. And they're saying, we'll let the microservices happen. And everyone that says like, oh God, they're just a really inefficient mining company and they're tricking people. That's not their bet. Their bet is that there'll be a whole bunch of little microservices, and in order for people to use them, they need some Bitcoin, and the whole KYC process is super duper annoying. So if you just build it right into their computer, they don't have to think about it. They can interact with these very micro level services without having to go through KYC. Interesting. I think they're the most interesting company in Bitcoin right now, to be honest. I don't know if their thesis plays out, but it's by far the most out there thesis. It's the game changer type thesis, as opposed to, all right, let me take something done in the financial world and try and replicate it sort of on the Bitcoin side. Or let me take one actual activity in the non-Bitcoin world and try and move it to a Bitcoin or blockchain. This is the one where it's the big, they're going for the big ask for the big play. All right, guys, unfortunately, this has been the story of my day today. I've been late for every single thing today, including my next call. So I'm going to have to go. I apologize again for my late start here. At least we got to the questions that were asked. And if there's anything we missed, shoot us an email and we'll do it in writing.
Okay, we'll try to catch up next week on the next live session on innovation, taking place at exactly the same time as today, where none of us will be late. So we'll see everyone next week at 12 Eastern Standard Time.
I'll be there. I think by none of us he means me, but okay. Well, I accept that. It's a fair comment.
All right. So
All
everyone
right.
have a great weekend.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.